They take the current state of things and then they say that is the solution. Environmental pollution is making people infertile. We should not have kids because the environment is so bad. Oh my God. Yeah, it's really wild. But I've always considered myself a socialist, always been on the left, never ironically played around with supporting Donald Trump. I think his administration will be disastrous. And that said, I do know a lot of people that made that kind of leap. They don't necessarily use the term post-left. I'm not sure how they would describe themselves, but there is this kind of real, I mean, even from people I intellectually respect that will be like, I am not part of the left. Whatever weird abolish the family stuff y'all are getting into, I'm not a part of that. And it's like, you are spreading, literally the America First people repost your post. You are doing the propaganda for them, and normal people think this is weird. Stop doing that. We should be able to say that as someone who is on the left. This is bad optics. Stop. What are we going to have? A political coalition of just dissident intellectuals? Like that doesn't, right?
And what they say to that is they say, well, if you just need to convince them of the position, you just need to convince people, change minds. And what I think is
people to abolish their families.
Any politics that's predicated on the idea that everyone has to think exactly like how you do, that you need to change everyone's mind so that reality coincides with what you want to happen, that will always fail. Any politics that happens builds coalitions and it capitalizes on a geist that is already forming. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It doesn't just come out of a fringe. And abolish the family. I mean, it's like it's such bad optics that it almost seems like an op. It seems like the Fed would back this stuff. You
know what? As a childless man, the neoliberals have done a great job of abolishing my family. Here we are again with the current crisis as a solution to the crisis. It's perfect. We need to win people over. We need to have a broad coalition if we're going to make political changes. And that means, having messages that are appealing to the democratic majority of people. So very important.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am here with Joshua Citarella, an artist and a writer who studies all kind of weird shit, all kind of different internet subcultures, all the Zoomer ideologies, and someone who I met quite randomly in Toronto at a party, I believe. And I remember when they're saying Joshua Citarella is going to be, you should talk to him. He's an artist, and I didn't know who you were. And I remember when, like, this is before, I looked stuff up, and we just started talking about central planning and cybernetic socialism, and I was like, yo, this guy is based. So I'm here with Josh Citarella, also host of the Doom Scroll podcast. It's been taking off recently, a really interesting podcast, and all around cool guy. Josh, who are you?
Tony, wonderful to see you. Thanks for having me. Yeah, we have a few mutual friends, among them Greg Dreg, as people may know him, Art Chad, Brogan, and so on. Yeah, so I guess if people are not familiar with my work, most recently I am probably more well known as the host of the Doom Scroll podcast. Previous to that, probably for the past 6 years, I've been writing, researching, publishing about young people who got politicized online, primarily through memes, podcasts, videos, content, all ways, shapes, and forms. So from the left, right, all over the political spectrum. About 4 years ago, I started a newsletter and a podcast through Patreon and Substack. I've been publishing, I guess, since 2020. I did episode 1 of my podcast before the pandemic. Episode 2, we were already in lockdown. So it was right about the time, just a smidge earlier before everyone got into the space. But I started that because I came from, as you said, this background of the art world where, I teach in academies, universities, I show in galleries and museums. That's where I was trained. That's what I studied in school. And this is, an elite cultural sphere. A lot of people were not very interested to talk about the memes, images, and radical teenagers that I thought were making pretty significant shifts in American culture. Teenagers who would make memes that were then reposted by the sitting president. I thought those things were kind of important and, aesthetically significant. I decided to just self-publish that work. So the last few years of my career and life have been breaking from institutions, exiting to, crowdfunding and platforms and so on. So I exist kind of between those two worlds now.
What made you want to get into internet subcultures like, the different weird ideologies, the different niches? Is something that you spend a lot of time on, and you're, of course, quite a bit older than you look. You look extremely good for your age. I was pretty shocked to find out your age, to be honest. So why are you studying all this weird stuff?
Yeah, so I'm 37 years old. I am not a 17-year-old shit poster, although I have interviewed many people of that age. I think the reason why I was interested in this material is because coming from this background of, what we call the intersection of art and tech, these were big conversations that in 2011, I was part of a reading group that was talking about what is Bitcoin going to do to, the political economic implications of this piece of technology. And at that time, Bitcoin was worth $1,000, and it was really making a lot of headlines because this is something that was a kind of silly, dismissible piece of tech that was worth, fractions of pennies. Now it's, as of this recording, it's $100,000. Maybe next week it's, half of that or double that. We don't know. But the idea that technology, social media technologies included, platforms in general, were going to have significant effects in reorganizing our political economies. That stuff was very, very interesting to me for a long time. So there were kind of 3 successive reading groups based in New York City, where I'm from, primarily from people who worked in the fields of tech and art, having these conversations outside of any other academy or university setting. And a lot of those ideas turned out to be just really influential. There was no existing expertise or discipline from which to study them. And so we were just kind of commenting on things in real time and bringing a political analysis to them. So most importantly, the libertarian perspective onto things like social media in general, gatekeeper lists, editor lists, publications, giving a voice to everyone. We may think of this as being something that is implicitly democratic and egalitarian. My read on it was that it was always libertarian. And then similar to a lot of the, Bitcoin obviously is a digital gold standard, all of this stuff, very steeped in libertarian ideology. From that, I was following anarcho-capitalist memes because I just thought they were hilarious. I spent actually kind of a lot of time looking at ANCAP communities on like Reddit and like all over the internet, every platform that exists, there's some of these guys. And on Instagram, I was watching these accounts start to undergo a very interesting, unusual political transformation around like 2016, where this is what emerged into the, as we were calling it then, the alt-right. That means a lot of different things. Some of them were indeed capital A alt-right, like, of the Richard Spencer variety. And then other people were just kind of miscellaneous shit posters. And that term just meant a very big spectrum of stuff. I got really interested in that subculture because those people underwent this ideological transformation that I thought correlated with a number of the other observations that I was seeing in this space. So if we were to recount maybe like the past, let's say like 10 plus years of like American politics, I would say that the most influential field was this kind of techno-libertarian camp of the kind of Peter Thiels of the world, the Koch brothers, the Cato Institutes, and so on. People who are looking to make a capital exit from the structure of the nation state. And then within the past 10 years, those people have now all become pretty much comfortably enmeshed into what we would call the National Conservatism Project. So there's a big political evolution in that type of thinking. And this is a real world political faction that was being reflected in the kind of hyperbolic, exaggerated shit posting memes that literally teenagers were posting, to my great surprise. I thought I was following just a group of, deluded, crazy adults who had great taste in memes. Turns out that they were, some of them, 12 and 13 years old. So that was very surprising to me. I had participated in Tumblr and other types of internet communities before. I was aware that a lot of the posters in these spaces are much younger than we generally account for. But it was, I must admit, like a bit shocking 8 years ago to see that some of these posts, very influential memes and so on, were made by, literally children who were too young to drive. So I thought this is a pretty important space. This is, real ideological material that is going to shape their lives going forward. And then that has been the project ever since. So I've made it a point to be in, deep qualitative interviews and discussions with these people to understand the things that have shaped their worldview. And all of that is to try and, unpack, do this early detection and to kind of forecast the shape of American politics. And we're seeing some of those things play out now. So yeah, a few important bets there that turned out to be influential.
So why do these niche ideologies and subcultures matter, right? So it's easy for
Mhm.
someone to maybe
Right.
dismiss it all as just online fandoms that doesn't really have an effect in the real world, but does it, right? And I mean, for someone who, might not be quite aware of what we're referring to, I think most people who listen are, I really think our mutual friend J-Reg embodies the kind of Zoomer zeitgeist of portraying all the different niche ideologies, right? In his kind of performance art that he does. Like, he has the centrist side, the kind of
Mhm.
which manifests the spirit of rejecting centrism, but kind of picking whatever is just anti-centrist, and
Yeah, yeah.
whether it be libertarian, anarcho-primitivism, Marxism-Leninism, Maoism, whatever. There's all these different, and then there's even more micro niches like transhumanism, accelerationism. Uh, but you've been talking about for a while how some of this has real effects in the world and how you follow people's journeys, who have been radicalized on the internet and how it's kind of like shaped their life. So I'm kind of curious about, why does this really matter, right?
Yeah, yeah. So what would it mean if, for example, when someone was like 14, 15, they were into punk music and they called themselves an anarchist. And then they, go to college, maybe they get a job, whatever it is, they're in their adult life and they don't think about anarchy anymore whatsoever. It was just like a kind of cringy phase that they went through. And that does indeed happen with some of these internet subcultures. On the other hand, there are moments where these things are, very impactful, and the ideologies that people study and participate in online have, clear effects in the real world. I think the first thing that kind of caught people's attention were acts of, lone wolf violent extremism. Obviously, these are people who are kind of radicalized in these, online spaces and then go out and do some kind of devastating, horrific act in the real world. That attracted a lot of attention from the state, a lot of attention from think tanks, all sorts of organizations that sprung up to kind of counter this stuff, CVE, so on and so forth. And I think that there is meritable work that has been done in that space, and that space is kind of thoroughly mapped and well understood now, especially a lot of it having roots in the global war on terror. Years before that, a lot of those literally the same studies, predictive models, diagrams, and so on were then applied to this more recent phenomena of radicalization and lone wolf terror. On the kind of less extreme end of that, there is this kind of general question of media, of the messaging that you're exposed to, the ideas that you digest in your news feed and take in every week. How does that shape your worldview? When does that correlate to political activity? So, a very easy one to measure for young people is whether they see a post online and then decide to go out on the street and join a protest. That's a kind of measurable, qualifier for whether our media affects our actions in the real world. Second to that, I would say paper membership to organizations. There's a lot of people I know who have since joined political organizations on left, right, all over, really based on the media that they consume. And then third, and most obviously, what is people are very interested to talk about in the past few weeks is how they decide to vote based off of their media, right? And we're having all of these conversations about the influence of young male podcasters. I wrote a thing on Substack. I was calling it bro populism. I'm not necessarily sure what to describe it as, but clearly the media that we consume is shaping some type of political activity. Those are easy examples of it. You might also think of whether someone is primed to join a union in their workplace. Like, are they immediately allergic to that suggestion based on the media that they consumed, that this is something that's going to, squeeze your wages and steal from you and is going to reduce your kind of, individual flexibility? Are these guys extorting you in your workplace? Or is this an opportunity to build solidarity, to increase your material well-being, to engage in collective bargaining, and so on? So all of that kind of ideological interpretation of what those words mean are shaped by the media that we consume. I think we're, inclined to dismiss these things in some cases because everything on the internet feels a little bit ethereal and it's in the cloud and it's not real or whatever. But if we were having this conversation in, I don't know, like the 1940s and people were reading radical Trotskyite newspapers, like it's always been clear that media has a profound effect on how we view the world and then our political actions that follow it. So yeah, all of those things seem to be, I think, very important. And then we introduce this question that kind of comes from media theory of like, what does the unique affordances of the attention economy do to politics? What kind of effect does that have? And then you're into questions of design, political philosophy, ideology, and kind of all of that interesting stuff.
Following these different ideologies, I wanted to talk first about the tendencies on the left and then the tendencies on the right, and kind of pick your brain on your takes on the individual tendencies. But before we get to that, I am curious, what you believe the general zeitgeist is in terms of like the direction it's moving, and which political tendencies on the right and which tendencies on the left are becoming more dominant, aka kind of winning, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because of course the zeitgeist is always contradictory. It's moving in different directions, but like which particular tendencies on the left and right are moving, as well as a general geist. Because I also think there's a general geist that manifests itself in the quote unquote normies. And to me, like what a normie is like, I don't really believe in the concept of normality that much. I think it's more to do with like, what I mean by normie is just someone who's not hyper politicized, right? Like always fixated on politics, kind of like bro populism. Bro populism appeals to people like that. I used to do a lot of martial arts, so I know that mentality very well. That, people I talked to in the locker rooms about stuff, they would say on one hand, it'd be like, yeah, I like Bernie Sanders, man. He's like anti-establishment. He's against the wars. But then like, oh, the trans,
Right, right.
be
Yeah, yeah.
very all over the place, right? So yeah, I'm curious, kind of a big question there, but I think it could get us in some interesting directions.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the general geist, I think the sentiment of most people, regardless left, right, or wherever they come from, is just that we are in a, extreme period of concentration of elite power. And so populism is the word that is, on everyone's lips at the moment. I think for good reason, because our institutions seem illegitimate, our state seems illegitimate. Yeah, and so it's kind of it's kind of difficult for people to, especially consultants within the Democratic Party, for example, to take into account that, the people that an anti-establishment candidate appealed to, they don't necessarily have a firm grasp of policy. It's kind of not normal to even think about this stuff in depth. It's like whoever is against the status quo that is not working, that's the guy I like. I think that's how most people kind of approach these things. So Sanders to Trump, it's like whoever's going to do it, just you gotta get these corrupt people out because they're screwing everything up. So yeah, they're amenable to a lot of different solutions and maybe not rigorously involved in a policy level. I don't think we can blame people for that. So yeah, yeah. I mean, to kind of get back to your question before of like why these things are important, who is winning and what direction things are taking, I'll kind of like lay out a few different examples. So we'll try and like lay a spectrum here. But as I first started writing about these things in 2018, I published a short book called Politogram and the Post-Left. What post-left meant at that time, so saying post-left in 2024, will generally conjure an image of people who were Bernie Sanders supporters and then join this kind of new right coalition, like post-liberal, sometimes people call it, there's a few different terms. At that time in 2018, post-left meant very clearly anarcho-primitivism, anti-civilization, post-civilization, green anarchy, kind of black bloc, insurrectionary anarchism, people who had lost faith with the possibility or the hopes for unionization or building a socialist project and saw what we would today call the left, generally speaking, as being the kind of countervailing force that allows capitalism to maintain itself. And if there was no left, then capitalism would inevitably, collapse, lead to its own demise. I think all of that is deeply mistaken. but that was the interpretation from these people at that time. And the term they used for it was post-left, that they were an evolution of thinking beyond the left. Yeah, losing faith with the possibility of like organizing at the point of production. And so that leads you to things that are, very much like techno skepticism. People would talk about a salvage economy after climate collapse, living in eco villages. People kind of further on the spectrum would talk about a neo-band society of nomadic hunter-gatherers living off the natural abundance of the land. There's a kind of variety of different interpretations, all the way from like Mad Max to like utopian eco communes. So it's a wide gamut. But I would say that was kind of what rose up and they
Kaczynski
cite
stuff,
this.
right?
Oh, sorry, say that again.
Ted Kaczynski too, kind of his
Yeah,
appeals there, right?
huge figure. Yeah, Ted Kaczynski and John Zerzan, Bob Black also being a very influential figure in this sphere. And the particular group that I followed in the book began in Instagram. They moved to medium.com, in which they maintained for about a year. They had weekly updates to the shared blog with maybe a dozen plus contributors to it. And one of the essays writes about their disappointment, being disillusioned after the Bernie Sanders loss in 2016. And then, obviously what they needed to do was to kind of retreat from society and start these eco communes or so on. So, taking that in stride, being the kind of overzealous imaginings of someone who was, I think at that time, age 17 or something, one can take a sympathetic reading of these things, that the kind of possibilities of social democracy in the United States was very thrilling to young people, and that disappointment was very severe. And so they kind of lost hope with, the possibility for even maintaining civilization. What's the dumbest thing you thought when you were age 17? There's a whole gamut of things. So I would say that characterized much of the left in the years following that. I think we have seen a significant progression from that. And I think disappointment with the CHOP, for example, or the BLM protests, and a kind of the lack of efficacy and, measurable, quantifiable change from any of that horizontalist, disorganized protest has caused a lot of people to reconsider those things. And they've also just grown older in this time. On the right, what I noticed very early on, and I wrote about this in 2018, and I would say that this has less of a progression. I think it's just a more kind of clear development in their thinking, is that the kind of Reaganomics, libertarian leaning wing of to whatever degree American conservatism had accepted those neoliberal principles, free market evangelism has kind of disappeared from that political movement. And people are much more inclined to be civic nationalist, paleo conservative, some strain of that type of heterodox economic populism with kind of strict borders, strict control of immigration, things like that. Still maintaining a commitment to the underlying principles of capitalism, private ownership of the means of production, waged labor, private property, all of these kinds of things. But then we'll kind of throw in unexpectedly, in some cases, like use the term social democracy. So it's a very interesting period in which, the clear failures of the free market, I think, are just not appealing to particularly young Gen Z people on the right. It's hard to hold water for those type of policies because the failures of the market are just evidenced all around you, And so there is this kind of like economic rethinking in which people throw away the libertarian stuff and they embrace more protectionist, isolationist policies. I guess the current iteration of that is national conservatism. So that was something that I wrote, I don't know, maybe like, I guess in 2018, so 6 years ago. And, that is kind of tracking with, to whatever degree J.D. Vance may be influential. There's a lot of different, people speaking in Trump's ear, Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy, as you had said before. They have very different economic programs from the J.D. Vances of the world. But these internet spaces are kind of creeping in ever so slowly into the real world. And I think it is an important space to watch if we're looking for ideological forecasting, what kind of developments are on the horizon.
The post-left was a subject that I wanted to talk about in the back room after, because I think that is a whole subject in itself, the post-left and what that means, because I find that to be an interesting phenomenon, and an interesting label. I have certain criticisms of it, but, when it comes to the general Geist, my impression is that generally people are moving in a socially conservative direction and an economically left direction. And
Right.
I would say, for the majority of people, it's in a kind of moderate direction in both ways. Like it's a moderately economically left agenda direction and a moderately socially conservative agenda. When I see like what's going on, of course there's a gender divide that people talk about, like that people are like men especially are becoming more conservative and women are becoming more liberal. But I think, those polls can be a little misleading. I kind of think that even women are also going in a more socially conservative direction generally. But what that means is sometimes confusing because, especially to people on the left, they think socially conservative entails like necessarily racism or necessarily theocracy or, being anti-gay or something. But it's a sentiment that I think is a backlash to what was the previous Geist, which I think the previous Geist, ever since third way neoliberalism, because let's remember, original neoliberalism was kind of socially conservative and economically right.
Right.
Whereas third way liberalism, the Blairite era, the 90s, the Clinton era, was a more, and I would say up till really Obama, a kind of economically uh, rightward shift and a socially leftward shift.
Yes.
And I don't think most people had an issue with the socially leftward shift until the college campus. There's a kind of tendency on college campuses. People have all different kind of terms to describe this. They say wokeism. I felt like I understood what this meant, but now it's people throw it around in a way that I don't really know what people are referring to anymore. But I think we have an idea of what we're talking about, like tendencies such as woke scolding, right? I know you've had on your show a lot of people who critique this sort of side of the left, like Catherine Liu. Some people have called it the professional left or ideology that comes out of the professional managerial class. There's a lot of debates as to where this kind of thinking emerges from. But I also think it's not just like campuses; it's also companies adopting a sort of pseudo progressive language to
Yeah.
appeal to larger demographics, and the sort of backlash is, it's a backlash to all of that, right? And it seems contradictory, socially conservative and economically a little left. But I mean, certain ways it's not contradictory to be socially left and economically right. So, the
Mm.
backlash I think makes sense, but I'm curious as to how you see this general direction. And also back to the other question I asked before, which is the tendencies you see growing on the right side and the left side. You did answer about the right side. On the left side, I see the biggest one is the Marxist-Leninists, what I'll call the generic Marxist-Leninists, not the not the hardcore orthodox ones, but this
Mhm.
generic one,
Mhm.
which is sort of like China, being very pro-China, even pro-Russia a lot of the time, being
Sure.
pro-USSR, and kind of often there's an overlap with these types in being highly socially conservative in some regards,
Yes.
you know? So yeah, kind of that's my sort of reading on it, but I'm curious what your analysis is.
Yeah, yeah. And, in some cases, these online movements may be a reflection of the outside world, and in some cases, not. Yeah, I mean, I think the development of like the MAGA communism guys, for example, is a pretty significant online force. They're very entertaining. They have great memes. Every now and then, they make a big splash into some mainstream story or get a big platform. They also now have a real world political party with a charter and a footprint in I think they did it in Chicago, Illinois. However large that is, I don't know if it's tens of people or hundreds of people, but there are small increments of progress being made in that department. I've met some of these people in real life, for example. I don't really think that it has the same amount of. I think that this is a kind of hyperbolic reflection of some things that are in the zeitgeist. I don't think that this is a large, scalable political movement. That's my strong inclination about it. But, to kind of respond about the general geist of like people moving towards social conservatism and then a left wing political program, I would say that is kind of accurate. But, at a certain point, the center is always a moving target, So if like the center was, I don't know, gay marriage under Obama's first term, right? When he ran for president the first time around, he didn't support gay marriage, and then the second time he did. And people suspected that he did indeed support it, but he wouldn't take that position because it wasn't popular. I think that these are things that broadly have support. I don't think that gay rights are going anywhere. I think that to the degree to which trans stuff just kind of occupies an enormous amount of media time and political discourse, there may be some type of backlash in that a lot of people like just don't know a trans person in real life, and then start to wonder what then are the priorities of the Democratic Party if we spend so much time talking about an issue that applies to literally no one they have ever met. I mean, I live in the epicenter of the most progressive city and the most progressive industry in the world. And, even within this industry, trans issues affect a very small number of people. So I have to wonder that if you grow up somewhere that is not a coastal elite area and you just hear an endless amount of media attention on this, between the lines, you start to put together that like, well, these people are talking about X instead of talking about Y. It's like they don't want to talk about the economy. They want to talk about some other kind of culture war type of issue. And as a result, those things have gotten, I think, less popular. So yeah, the degree to which I really kind of feel like that stuff the kind of public polling on this is an indication that there's something else they wish were prioritized. I kind of think that trans stuff will be, I don't know, similar to gay rights, where most people eventually support it, realize that this applies to a minority of people, don't necessarily want to enforce some type of, conservative social need to organize society according to strict gender roles. But they do, I think, correctly read this in some cases, in that, we're talking about this issue to avoid talking about the other stuff, And I mean, this has been since basically 2016, the vector of attack onto the class project of Sanders, where Clinton started it with, race and gender and every other kind of identity-based angle. How is nationalizing the banks going to solve racism? All of that type of nonsense. And now we've just been kind of like playing that game ever since. And people are, they've gotten a bit wise to it. They're a little bit like exhausted by the degree to which we talk about these things. So yeah. I mean, the other, I guess, generous charitable interpretation of this stuff is that, look, I'm a millennial. I'm 37. I do not have children. I have friends who have children, but a lot of people who kind of grew up under this third way Democratic Party are now at a point in their lives where, you think you're going to be young and punk forever, but it would be kind of nice to have a family. That's like the most meaningful thing that a lot of people do in their lives. And, throwing your whole life into these professional middle class careers is just personally very disappointing in many cases, where now you're at, maybe you got a promotion, and if you moved up in whatever advertising or graphic design job, whatever you happen to do, but you've paid a tremendous personal cost for that. And your friends who took maybe more conventional lives and went into trades or went into more dependable work that was not of the professional class that the Democrats represent, they have children and they have long-term relationships, and they didn't, pour their whole lives into their careers. And that is, this is not just for me personally, but a kind of a progression of, I think, many millennials at this age who grew up with social media and are now thinking is like, well, was it really that progressive of me to sacrifice the most meaningful interpersonal relationships I could have to further my career, to make like graphic design for some fucking company that does, premium matte, whatever they call it, millennial Memphis corporate design? Is like, that's not a meaningful life. And so, yeah, I think people are having to question some of those things now. I don't know if that's necessarily an emergent social conservatism. I think that's just kind of common sense values for most people. They don't seem to be recanting on their progressive positions. It's just an inflection point that is kind of evidence of this third way compromise as being just a complete and total failure for like, socially, economically, and so on.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, conservatism tends to just mean a reaction to progress or what they
Mm.
perceive as progress, as opposed to like, a defined set of agendas or whatnot. So, even though what you're describing seems like common sense values, and it seems conservative because there was this direction for a long time with progressives that would, tell you actually having no kids is good for the environment, right? Actually, you should
Fucking
live modest,
crazy. Yeah.
you know? And I
Right.
think that the shift in the conservative, quote unquote, direction and the economically left direction, it's not a mere confusion. It's not that people are merely confused. It's based in a real material reality. And I think you addressed something very important when you mentioned that the polling seems to suggest that it's not that people are necessarily completely opposed to trans rights or women's rights or racial rights. I mean, there's certainly some people who are, but a lot of people, I think the silent majority generally only react negatively when they see those issues prioritized over their immediate economic interests or economic interests that they would,
Right.
share with other people of the same class position, right? And, you know, it's like Dave Chappelle is a good example of this. Dave Chappelle, I don't agree with the conclusion he went to or the kind of direction he was trying to promote with his joke he was making about the trans issue, which got a lot of flack. But what he was pointing to was, he was saying why have poor blacks had to fight so long for their rights? And, this issue suddenly has become mainstream and has gotten more success in such a short amount of time. Like, what's up with
Mm.
that? It seems it's compatible almost with the establishment. And what I think he's speaking to there, even though I think it's not, it's kind of like it's a reaction that does lead to, instead of addressing the problem, it just ends up blaming other groups, which I think is what the establishment wants.
Right.
But what he's speaking to is the fact that, why are we talking about this issue before another issue, right? Like, it's only common sense that people are going to care about what affects them, and they're not going to oppose an issue if it doesn't affect them, right? I think people are kind of socially libertarian in this aspect. And I think in Canada, it's a great reflection of this, because in Canada, we're the most socially liberal country in the world in many ways. Like, some people even like to joke Canada is the gayest country in the world, right? Like, Canada is just, it's America without without the uh, evangelicalism, right?
Hmm.
And Canada has definitely gone in a socially conservative direction lately. I've seen it everywhere. And it's because I think Justin Trudeau, who has been our prime minister for the last almost decade, he has been, economically not really changing anything like to help working families.
Yeah.
And he's been, he's the epitome of the token progressive. He'll
Yes.
change language, he'll change street names, he'll do all these progressive things to signal to different groups to say, look at me, I'm changing things. And that just gets a horrible reaction. People hate that. And this is where leftists will come in and will say, see, this problem, it's not the left, it's liberals, right? It's the liberals. Liberals aren't leftists. And they have a point. But there is a real issue in which a lot of this kind of progressive capitalist thinking bleeds into the left. And I think the perfect example of that is that environmentalist ideology, which will say things like, the population decline, that's not a problem. It's actually good that the population's decline.
Right.
Or that, you shouldn't have kids because it's good to save the environment. Or that, we should reduce consumption among everybody, not just the rich. Everyone in the West should consume way less.
That's going to go over great. Yeah.
Yeah, it's gonna be great if you tell them you're gonna degrow their living standards, right? And I'm always worried when I see an emerging, what looks to appear a left capitalist a left progressive ideology that seems to coincide very well with capitalism's, emergent form, which I think capitalism is going to have to cope with the fact that, one, there's falling rates of profit. Firms are not going to be as profitable. It's going to be harder to make money. The economy has been shrinking. It's actually the biggest reason for job loss, much more than automation has. And also the fact that they're going to have to cope with climate change. But the people who run society, the ruling class, they're not going to want to, make big sacrifices on their part. So they're going to say, everyone just consume less. It's almost a perfect ideology of green austerity to
Yeah.
reinforce the existing system. And the problem is I would love it if it was only the liberals that were the problem, but there's a lot of leftists who believe this stuff. Like the liberal capitalist ideology tends to bleed into the left sphere. And I think, part of that reaction against that, the left, I think, would be able to be stronger if it didn't, in the eyes of so many people, Like in the eyes of many people, the liberal capitalists and the quote unquote left aren't that distinguishable. And
Yeah,
it's easy to look, say they're just confused, but I think there's a reason why it's not so obvious. It should be obvious, right? I don't know what you think
it
about all
should
that.
be. It should be. Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest problem with climate change is that the labor camps in Siberia that I throw all the environmentalists in are just they're going to be warm now. They're not going to be cold enough. So that's my primary worry about it. I'm 50% joking about that, but yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what you're saying that there's a huge faction of the kind of liberal left that has basically taken the current crisis as a solution to itself, right? Like the economy is shrinking, so we need to like degrow jobs or whatever. There's, I mean, just this incredible complacency. You can extrapolate this, things like defund the police. It's like, okay, so city budgets are getting smaller. Everything under neoliberalism is the product of austerity. There's belt tightening across every sector. And so, these people who are the radical visionaries, the utopian thinkers of today, the solutions they come up with are like, okay, we'll do more budget cuts. We'll do budget cuts so extreme such that these things no longer exist. And it's like, great. Well, neoliberalism was giving you that anyway. Do we have any other solutions in the hat that we can pull out of? Yeah, and I really think that basically the environmentalist movement right now are like libertarian foot soldiers, essentially. It has nothing to do with the left. I'm not sure how we're going to build all of this high speed rail or affordable housing if we can't use concrete. These people are just not interested to talk about it. So yeah, I have a very, few hopes for that movement, and I think there's a reason why they're not part of like the left. Yeah, it's a different thing. It's like a
I
weird
think
streak of liberal anarchism. No, there's a great essay called literally The Anarcho-Liberal by Bhaskar Sankara that talks about some of this stuff too.
oh, that sounds interesting. I'd like to read that. See, my position before was that they're not real leftists. And maybe that's true in the sense that they kind of are divorced from an authentic grassroots, a working class left. But this is because we presuppose what a correct left is, and that the left is
Right.
inherently like a socialist movement. Increasingly, I've kind of started to take a different position, which is that
Hmm.
it actually a lot of these problems do come out of the left. The problem is the type of left and the fact that the left increasingly has been characterized by college educated and urban divide. Like people who are in urban areas, college educated, being very divorced from the living experiences and general attitudes of people who aren't college educated. So there's like that fundamental contradiction, and that's been going on for a while. Quite. It's been a long time in the making. I think in many ways, George McGovern and like the movement he represented on the Democratic Party was a kind of step in this direction of a sort of left that lost a lot of its popular appeal with the working class. It was all about this idea of change. And that's why I think it is kind of left, even if it's not the left we would like it to be. So the goal should be about like reforming the left, not so much, I think, saying like, oh, that's not left, because
Yeah.
the thing is like a lot of the tendencies that we find annoying on the left are actually not very liberal at all. Like, if
Mhm.
you think about like
Sure.
cancel culture,
Yeah.
the idea of policing people, it's a very sort of carceral attitude that's anti-pluralist, right? It's about kind of it's very anti free speech. It's not very compassionate either. It's not liberal in a very etymological sense. It's not very
Right.
generous and compassionate, and also with the kind of it's not very real left, it's liberal. I think if we look at like what left really has meant, I think left in general could be defined by a movement towards one, progress, and equality. Those are very vague things, right? And I think the left has been
Indeed.
totally divorced from like a class politics and socialism. And without that, what do you really get? Progress isn't necessarily bad for capitalism. It could be very good for capitalism. Capitalism is highly progressive, and that's not to say, right, that like, a lot of the progress that's been made hasn't been good. A lot of it has. But what if we have a politics that is progress or everything except something that hurts capital?
Right.
That's going to turn people against that progress, right? And that's
No,
kind
very
of
true. Very true. Yeah. 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 They associate, I gave this example somewhere. This is maybe a podcast a few years ago, but let's say that in your city that you grew up, someone has a license for a taxi cab, and Uber comes in and they just outcompete all of the taxi cabs. And then when Uber has the rainbow during Pride Month on their logo, it's like you're still gonna resent this company because your family had like a middle class life, and now your parent who drove the cab lost their job. So those things become they're very very meaningless at a certain level. Yeah, I mean, I guess as we're getting into the weeds on like, which left and what left and all of this kind of stuff, it's something that I'm interested to chase. I think, yeah, I generally would see like the environmentalist movement and a lot of the Greens, particularly in Europe, as being basically this kind of like anarchist strain of liberalism and had not having a connection to like a trade unionist left or a socialist left. Some of them are, anti-socialist. Anarchists and socialists have important disagreements. I also kind of take the position that, I'm someone who comes from the socialist tradition. Those are the things that I read. I also was, versed in kind of libertarian ideas, trying to really understand what neoliberalism is, where these ideas come from, why they developed in capitalism, all of that stuff. And I think that there is this kind of, maybe we've talked about this like a bit before, but there is this kind of convergent evolution. Like I know that both you and I share this interest in the big three, the Amazon, Googles, and Walmarts of the world that engage in a form of economic organization which does not utilize competitive markets. There's not a bidding war between multiple parties. They do not use price to allocate how they make a lot of their decisions. They just plan it top down, right? And these are things that have GDP that is, comparable to the size of the Soviet Union. They are quantitatively as large in some cases as the Soviet Union. So there's something really strange that is happening to this Cold War dichotomy of capitalism and socialism as we have known it, where transnational capitalist corporations employ economic planning better than the Soviet Union did, right? It's not something that we would have expected. There are aspects of this data collection in particular from Amazon and Google that fundamentally upend the calculation debate, as it was called in the 20th century, that now have greater knowledge than Hayek ever could have imagined, which was, the kind of underpinning theory of like solving this knowledge problem to then, require you to have price to direct resources to where they're needed most, all these types of things. So if our polls are right and left based on, markets versus planning, that thing is now all screwy because the capitalist corporations do planning better than the left was ever able to achieve. And yeah, things are a little bit messy right now. And then when you talk about like, okay, so the left is like this slow arc of progress towards a horizon of freedom, or whatever the fucking Hegelian like shit. What does that even mean? Like I have no idea. So I think we kind of have to bracket it out where it's useful now to say like the left, in contrast to liberals, is a short-term demand for social democratic infrastructure clawed back from the neoliberal consensus. And then the liberals are maintaining a neoliberal consensus and are not interested to make any social democratic concessions. When you get a little bit further than that and you start to talk about ideology and you start to talk about, long-term projects in the scope of like 40 years, not just an election cycle or two. Yeah, I mean, there are things that I would like to see, but I mean, this is both good and bad, but like there is no left, right? There's what are we talking about? We're talking about tiny organizations. We're talking about a few academics and institutions, all of which are totally captured by, weird elite interests. And so, and then at the same time, we have actually existing models of economic planning that, should transform the way we think about organizing our societies. The way that I think of these things is that it is now important to kind of formulate a left, because those opportunities, there's going to be moments at which we may be able to introduce democracy back into the planning of these corporations at some point in the future. So that is the kind of utopian horizon. I think a lot of these things are kind of just an inevitable development in, the scale of corporations, planned or market driven. But yeah, if you can find moments to, like, for example, obstruct the supply chain, shut down the factory unless you introduce elements of democratic planning, those are the politics that I think really excite me about the 21st century, and that's a far away from any discussion of like elections and whatnot. I should maybe just for like to kind of throw in a little bit of context here. My own background, some of the early writing that really captured my political imagination was from Nick Zernick and Alex Williams, authors of Inventing the Future, which was kind of the first one of these etiology type of memes where they called it fully automated luxury communism. And this, I mean, this is, Nick teaches at King's College in London. He's a lifelong academic. These are not people who are like teenage shit posters by any means, but like those things inspired people to make all of these different images. So yeah, thinking about things is like harnessing the political imaginary, being a necessary part of politics that brings you from the common everyday experience of the boring struggle for social democracy towards something else that comes after that's a little bit more exciting. I think all of those things are still important and worth thinking about.
You brought up central planning and democratic economic planning and the sort of thing that I think Lenin would call monopoly capitalism, setting the stage for socialism, right? And this is a very interesting topic. I think it's one of the first things we talked about. It's a strange interest to find yourself in. Definitely, like I'm kind of curious what got you into that specifically. But I think like stuff like that is the issues we should be talking about more, like these kind of the ways in which we can build on what already exists. What is the rational kernel or the silver lining rather of capitalism that could be employed in socialism? Like I wish we talked about that more. I do want to say before going right into that topic, with what you were saying about the left and the kind of these developments, these contradictions that have been happening. So back in 2016, I did my bachelor's thesis on the alt-right that was emerging from 2015 to 2016. And it was very interesting. I learned a lot from that. And I learned a lot about like these so-called SJWs and all that, the right's kind of reaction to that. And they would say that this is all due to the Frankfurt School and some big conspiracy to destroy Western culture. And then it kind of ironically got me interested into the Frankfurt School and a lot of theory. And I also found like I didn't really see that because the program I went to in university wasn't super quote unquote woke. I didn't see this till later in grad school more happen. And I went to a more technocratic liberal centrist program, if anything. That's the bias it had, which kind of that annoyed me a little bit, which is where I got into more radical theory in response to that. But, when I came out of the left that I was sort of quote unquote radicalized through, is prototypical as it sounds for like a person in the Western world, is like people like Noam Chomsky, for example.
Sure.
I used to listen to tons of Chomsky lectures, and I didn't really see like that was for me what was the left, right? Kind of what he represented, or in the more mainstream electoral variant being like the Ralph Nader or the NDP in Canada.
Yeah.
So when I didn't really see what the right was talking about, but then over time I kind of saw, oh yeah, this does exist actually. It's not like some big Marxist conspiracy. That's certainly not true. But this tendency that they're critiquing is a thing. Like it took a while for me to even acknowledge that, if that makes sense. It's just not like the end of the world, but it's definitely, I think, an impediment more to the left than anything, right?
Right.
Progress, because if any objections to this sort of thing, people who are proponents of the woke scoldy end of the left, they'll immediately want to tell you and say, well, so you're saying we should throw trans people and all minorities under the bus so we can talk about economic issues. And it's like, no, that's not what we're saying, right? Like they kind of assume that they think that in this dichotomous terms, or they'll say that, I don't know, there's also even, it goes really deep. Like in academia, there's a lot of narratives too that are very compatible with a project to cripple the left, even if it's not conscious. Like, the embrace of a lot of postmodern, post-colonial thinking, which will treat the Enlightenment project as some sort of, it was kind of a big farce to justify white supremacy and capitalism. Or the French and American revolutions were just bourgeois capitalist revolutions, and it's like they were, but we've lost.
But that was good. Yeah. Right.
Actually, the idea of progress. This is what's fascinating to me. The idea of progress itself is like the idea of like any kind of grand narrative of capitalism, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. That's just outdated, old white man Marx stuff. It didn't consider the fact that slavery happened and expanded. It's like all those things are kind of true. Like they bring up points, a lot of these thinkers, like, but the way in which they're used is to kind of cripple any narrative that the left could build on. You know what I mean? It's really hard to wrestle with, because I do see like there are a lot of tendencies on the left that are very crippling.
Yeah.
And I don't know, people have called the reason why I bring this up with you is because I saw some people speculate as to whether you were quote unquote post left, and from my knowledge, you're definitely not. I wouldn't say I'm post left either, because what does that really mean? Like post political, you know? Like I don't know, like
Uh,
today's.
no, I think when people say it now, they mean a specific crop of people, some of which I am socially adjacent to, that were Bernie supporters and then are now part of the new right. I actually know a lot of people who went through that political evolution. That does not apply to me. I've been a socialist since I started this. I'll be a socialist when I finish it. My interpretation of those things may mean some different things than other people, but just responding to exactly as you said, like when you talk to people from different political worldviews, right, left, and center, there's a strong kind of a knee-jerk reflex of people right now where my political opponent says that the sky is blue. Well, I'm going to say that it's red. It's like that was just a true statement. The thing that this person said was a true statement. And now because you're on opposite political sides, like you have to disagree with them. There are things that people say from different political blocks that may be true. And it's important to like align on those issues. So for example, like when crime was surging during the pandemic, there were a lot of voices from the center and the left that tried to say that this is not indeed happening, that it was a right-wing panic, that it was exaggerated or whatever. And I mean, look how it turned out for them. People voted for more police presence. The abolish the police shit went over really poorly. Like people were literally at threat, mostly working class people were at threat in their neighborhoods and wanted the police presence. They didn't like that they were being disproportionately profiled and all that other shit, but they wanted equal protection under the law. They didn't want it to go away. There's a kind of whole variety of issues on these things that like the left has just been the problem, essentially. Nuclear power, for example, that, this is something that is, Naomi Klein had a great, I think Doppelganger was a great book, her last one, but a book or two back, the one about climate change, where she's analogizes the project of nuclear power as being akin to continuing this legacy of colonialism and extraction and whatever else. And it's like, this is just by all measures the most efficient way of bringing out the bounty of energy per resources you put in. If you want a thriving and prosperous society that was the dream of the left, basically up until like the last few decades, where this weird like kind of suicidal cult of don't have children has like come into prominence. Like, I'm not part of that movement. I don't think most people want to be a part of that movement. That's like if you spend too long in the academy, it just slowly just rots your brain, And I mean, similarly, people will talk about this with like, the inflation that is a huge component of why people were dissatisfied with Biden and Harris. As that came around, people from the left were like, oh, this is right-wing fear-mongering. It's actually not so bad. And it's like, fuck, dude, groceries are so expensive. Are you
That
kidding me?
reveals their class position. When
That
people say stuff,
it does a
when
lot.
people
Yeah.
look, there's two big factors when I can tell, like, they're a trust fund socialist, which is, they or like, they just have a very cushy job in the university somewhere. Is when they say stuff like, oh, inflation is not a real problem, or they'll say something like, actually, the crime, it's over exaggerated. It's like, yeah, because you don't live in a poor area. Now,
Right.
I totally get the idea of reducing the power of the totalitarian state. I'm all for that. I think police are way too militarized. But if you decrease funding for police before getting at the root of crime, that's a recipe for disaster. It's like you're basically saying at that point that we just don't want to deal with the problem at all. And it's like, I think we should deal with the root cause. But if in the current arrangement, you can't say that like arming the police doesn't reduce crime to some extent. I mean, New York's an interesting example, right? I mean, Rudy Giuliani, hate the guy, terrible, right? But I mean, didn't crime go down after Giuliani's police reforms? It would have been better if he actually, instead of just locking everyone up, he dealt with poverty. But I mean, it's like, what are you going to tell people? You're going to just like, you're just going to tell the establishment to not arm the cops, but also allow them to not deal with the problem that's causing the crime. It's kind of weird. I don't know.
They don't have these problems in Sweden. There are other advanced nations in the world that just have very different relationships to their law enforcement because there's not much need for crime because everyone is adequately materially taken care for. Yeah, that's not the case in the United States. But maybe to get a little bit like deeper into this, the ways in which the left has participated or made some of these problems worse is specifically related to the Enlightenment, which is that people are generally afraid of it. It's slavery, it's colonialism, it's whatever. And that idea only comes out as a product of having basically spent your life in the academy, where you are participating in an Enlightenment institution that believes in the innate value of the individual, that both the peasant and the king are equal in the eyes of God and in the law, right? That there's not literal castes of society, because the things that come out when you abandon the Enlightenment framework, like fascism, theocracy, monarchy, caste systems, like all of these things that are thriving and well in the internet and kind of rearing their head in a few parts of the world right now. So to kind of dispense with that framing as if it was a failed project and it was, that the Enlightenment rather than the profit motive was responsible for the ills of modernity is just deranged and I think politically counterproductive, And so there has not been much of a debate or countervailing force to correct some of these ideas that as the history of the left moving through this, march through the institutions, these people becoming part of elite society and then kind of abandoning their class positions over time, perverse incentives of career upward mobility. Yeah, it's like the kind of academic left that is setting a lot of the rhetoric now that then flows through the publications, through the organizations, is amplified by crazy people on Twitter or whatever. Like this stuff is just, it is really hurting. It's really, it is in some ways a big part of the problem right now. So I think that this is kind of a moment of narrative reset. A lot of those people are just having to do some serious internal questioning after having like historically lost workers, voters of all racial backgrounds. It's like something they're saying is not resonating with the people that they purport to care about. So hopefully they take a lesson and kind of reevaluate some of these things. But yeah, I think that is to whatever degree that these things are, possible to litigate through discourse on platforms or whatever, like there is basically no other place to talk about it. Like if we had this conversation in a university right now, we would not be going back next week, right? Like we would lose our jobs. There are clear lines about what you can and cannot say, or what, thesis or dissertation would be accepted and would not. And those have just been, disastrous mistakes. So to whatever impoverished degree we get to carry on meaningful conversations over the internet, that is the best option we got right now. And hopefully there's some opportunity where there's different institutions in the future. But it is, I think necessary to say, because a lot of those things are just they're not fixable from where they are now. It is a total rebuild.
I think you'd really find the book Persecution and the Art of Writing by Leo Strauss very interesting because, it was written originally to say, his thesis more or less, to really oversimplify, is that classic and ancient philosophers, medieval and ancient philosophers had to write an esoteric writing and conceal a lot of their message, to make it accessible only to a small amount of people who read carefully because they wanted to avoid persecution, mainly from like the cathedral, the clergy, the people who were censored.
I thought you were talking about the other cathedral. I was like, oh, you mean just literally the church?
I mean, literally, yeah. Well, I mean,
Okay,
there's a cathedral today, but it's
the
kind of PMC left, right?
No, go on.
Yeah, that's funny. I think I'm not referring to Curtis Yarvin, but I mean, literal cathedral, and I kind of find it in a funny way that is becoming more relevant now because, like, especially in university institutions, there is so much self-censorship because it's so hard to actually move up the university hierarchy. To get a professorship is just so hard, let alone tenure. I mean, tenure, you have to be 80 years old before you can get that nowadays. And, I know people, right, who've had a lot of positions and they're very scared to say their opinions because they're afraid that they'll get blacklisted from writing something with Verso books, or they're afraid that they'll get, like not promoted, or they won't get a job at the university as easy. And, they will like even do some esoteric writing on themselves. Well, whenever they bring up a somewhat heretical point, they have to couch it by saying, and this thing is problematic, and this is why I'm not this, and blah blah. They always have to like preface with a PR message for everything. And I think what all of this does is it kind of represses a lot of the issues, and what happens is you have a return of the repressed. And what I think the return of the repressed is manifested heavily in this kind of demonic weird fusion that is Marxism-Leninism, which, this is my hot take, MAGA communism is Marxism-Leninism. It's just a kind of more demented version of it. There's a lot of Marxist-Leninists who want to say it's not Marxist-Leninist at all, it's fascist or it's something else. I actually think they're very similar to each other. They just kind of, if anything, the MAGA communism embodies the contradictions more clearly. And what I mean those contradictions, it's like a return of all the repressed things. So I'm highly critical of Marxism-Leninism and MAGA communism. Very critical. I would not consider myself a Marxist-Leninist whatsoever. But I think they're a product of the fact that there's two things that have been repressed in general political discourse in general. One of those things is communism, the legacy of communism, the inability to deal with the failures and successes of past socialist experiments in a kind of measured, balanced way that is, truthful, aside from merely just saying, oh, a million people, 100 million died, whatever, and just dismissing it. It's all a failure. It's kind of like taken an overcorrected form where people are saying, actually, Stalin was good, right? It's a return of the repressed in a very extreme form. And people who, when they wake up to kind of realizing they're brainwashed, their instincts, especially newly radicalized young people, not even young people, newly radical. I know people in their 40s who are like this, newly radicalized people in general, where they kind of realize that they're being lied to about the history of communism. So then they kind of believe the opposite stuff. They think, oh, well, actually, maybe Stalin was fantastic and did everything because he needed to do it. And the other aspect is a sort of like anti-woke, the idea that it's, somehow patriarchal to like believe in, having a family and 2-parent household and stuff like this. It, the reactions to the abolish the family stuff, reactions to all this kind of woke stuff, it kind of manifests in this form. And because we haven't dealt with this, sometimes that return of the repressed does take a reactionary form. A lot of the time it does. Like, so sometimes you do have people, they get into Alexander Dugin, they get into kind of like what is basically right wing and kind of, if you want to say fascist, borderline, like it's close to it, where it's like pretty much just, you believe in a kind of, you believe that Putin's Russia is what we need, right? And they'll fetishize China, but for the weird reasons. Like they'll kind of be like, yeah, they end up just supporting like the opposite of what the current Geist is. So I see it as ML as a return of the repressed. I guess the way I'd bridge this is your takes on that tendency specifically, and kind of the divisions within the left at the moment.
Oh, the tank. I mean, I don't want to sound like I just don't take a lot of that stuff seriously. I mean, it's, if you got a picture of like a hammer and a sickle and Stalin in your PFP, that's weird. I don't think that those are serious politics that are scalable. I kind of feel like this is a very attention catching, I mean, I love their memes, like red, yellow, Ron Paul Maoism. I think these things are hilarious. Pol Pot patriarchy, just all the shit that they come up with is just, it's really fun. But I don't think of this as being so much of a serious political force. I think, as we kind of said before, that it was like this kind of reactionary reflection to, the most exaggerated versions of where most people kind of are, which is just relatively socially center or allergic to the kind of neoliberal progressive social issues, and then economically a little bit to the left. This is like the most kind of exaggerated funhouse mirror of that type of thing. Yeah, but I don't think that that is a serious political force. And the people that I know that like work in political organizations, this is I don't think very impactful.
What
I
about
could be wrong
Marxism?
about that, but hmm?
What about Marxism-Leninism in general? Because I think it is becoming, I would say it's actually of the hard left,
Hmm.
so even further than like democratic socialists. I would say that's becoming a kind of dominant tendency, like a weird kind of generic Marxism-Leninism. I would say some of the three biggest left tube content creators right now are kind of have that tendency, but not the
Mm.
MAGA communism. They
And
ask like,
who would you put under that ML category of these like big YouTubers?
I think Hakim has been influenced. Second Thought, who's the biggest
Mm,
one, has been influenced heavily by Hakim,
mm,
and you can find it in his video on authoritarianism. I like those guys, by the way. I get along with them. I get it along with, especially with Second Thought. I've collaborated with him,
mm,
but I noticed in his video on authoritarianism, which I see these talking points a lot nowadays, which is, because liberals are hypocritical, right? Oh, see, America's authoritarian. You do it too, guys. Therefore, it's not a problem. And if it does exist, it's good because it's justified, which is like crush dissent or whatever. Like they kind of just avoid the question. I feel like that paves the way for a kind of politics that doesn't really avoid the problems of the past. You
mm,
know,
mm. Yeah, yeah.
need more restraint on power in a socialist system, not less. And it is like a tendency that is growing because I think people latch onto it because they perceive it to have succeeded.
Hmm.
Marxism, Leninism to them,
Right, right.
it
Yeah,
succeeded
yeah,
where anarchism, democratic socialism didn't. They'll
yeah.
try to find weird copes about the Nordic countries. They'll try to say Nordic countries were only successful because they exploited the global South or something. They try to come up with all these
How do
copes for why
they Yeah, I
that
don't
didn't.
know. That's okay. Yeah, the oil is coming from the South somehow. It's
Yes,
whatever.
I don't buy that
Yeah.
whatsoever.
That's
But they try to say all these weird arguments.
I think I
Um,
think I would meet you halfway for this in that I could totally see a revitalization of Marxism-Leninism being a thing internationally. I think in the context of the United States, it's going to be some version of a, kind of
I mean
democratic
within just
socialist.
I mean just within the left, not within the general public. I think this stuff has a hard glass ceiling because one,
Mm,
using the word communism like with a hammer and sickle, if you poll people, people are kind of weirdly more supportive of socialism, but once you go communism, the poll numbers is super down,
right,
tiny
right. Yeah,
majorities.
yeah.
So the word
Right.
is terrible to use.
I mean, that's true. That's true for any. It's communist, like any kind of political label. People are just like, ugh, weird to. It's not a big part of most people's lives. So all of that just, yeah, turns people off. If you tell them like I would say that broadly speaking, social democratic policies are like overwhelmingly popular. But yeah, revolutionary socialism not always the most popular with people. I think that I'm really speaking from like the kind of American perspective here, but I could totally see I don't know, somewhere else in the world, developing world, those things becoming pretty appealing.
It
Uh,
is.
yeah,
That's why I think they find it appealing, like
yeah,
Marxist-Leninists. They see it embodied in an already existing systems, like even though these systems are highly different and actually kind of aren't always aligned with each other, but like Vietnam, China, Cuba, these are systems that are at least seem to be maybe not so
mhm,
much Cuba, but they seem to be on the rise. And because of that, they're like, oh, well, maybe this is an alternative. I see it like, look, Jackson Hinkle, for example. He's a
mhm.
figure that's highly popular. It's really strange how popular he is. He's kind of one of these guys who, you know, I don't even know if he's even left wing anymore, but he embodies that sort of politics, and it does have an appeal. Like Diego Rosarin, actually, you mentioned it getting popular in the world. Diego Rosarin is this Latin American Mexican commentator. He has about over 1 million subscribers. He came on the show, and I kind of challenged him on some of these politics. But he's a very nice guy, very very cool. You probably do go on your show if you invite him. He's very popular and he speaks English very well, but he has this sort of politics, which is that, like, it's defined for him like everything is just in opposition to liberalism, and he sees like
Right.
China and Russia as this
Yes.
unified force against liberalism, and that's the kind of politics I see take becoming more dominant on the left. And I think there's so many problems with this politics and it has a hard ceiling in becoming successful. That's also another reason I'm against it. But I see it as a symptom of like a lot of the left's failures.
I mean, I would say that if we're talking about the shape of emerging factions, political developments in like the next few years, the kind of scope of the 20th century, what's going to be an influential force, we basically should only be talking about America and China. Like those are the models that are going to be rolled out across the rest of the globe. That is the fundamental ground of the competition. And so if you're, looking at the developing world or like small pseudo-socialist countries, I really think that those things are just, they're going to be absorbed into one of these other things. So, and that is a kind of complicated, there's a patchwork of economic zones within the very top-down model of China. And then there's going to be some changes made to this Western model, but those are fundamentally the tracks that I'm kind of interested to explore. And then the opportunities for democratic planning within each of those emerging models through the aggregation of data. And I think that China, as it stands now, stands a much better chance to do a lot of those things, particularly because of the design of WeChat compared to the American versions, where we will have this uncomfortable confrontation between private platforms and the state of who owns this data to then do, comprehensive planning of markets and infrastructure, housing, and whatever else. Yeah, that's the kind of the long scale take. So whether there are anomalies to the like global hegemonic systems like a Cuba that exists, or the Nordic countries, which I'm a big fan of in the short term, but I don't think that the US and China are going to outcompete basically everything else. So those are the models that I'm interested to kind of anticipate. I guess though I would say, because as we're getting towards we'll get into the paywalled section of this, I was thinking to kind of throw an interesting spicy topic up for conversation, because we were talking about hypocritical and counterproductive positions from the left, particularly in online discourse. There is, of course, the xenoestrogen question. There is the declining sperm counts among men since the 1970s, declining testosterone levels, the presence of microplastics, xenoestrogens, phytoestrogens, all of these things that basically endocrine disrupting chemicals, toxicants that circulate in our environment, in our food packaging, sometimes in our water supply even, that have feminizing effects on men, right? That are shrinking their balls and their dick and making their shoulders more narrow and like all of this stuff. And you say that to someone on the internet who is of a liberal or left-wing political worldview, and they'll be like, that is a right-wing conspiracy theory. Those things are untrue. You're spreading dangerous misinformation. It's like, no, these are studies that come from coastal elite liberal universities that have decades of empirical research behind them. These are things that should be met with top-down legislation on behalf of the state, because there's chemicals that are destroying human fertility that should be removed from production. And instead, you're choosing to deny that this thing even exists because you're threatened by, I don't know, what people have in sperm. I'm not really sure what it is, but this like knee-jerk reflex of your opponent says that the sky is blue, you got to argue with them and tell them that it's red, which is just blatantly untrue. I find that to be like one of these just super, super potent wedges, right? That like it's literally a material problem. There's material in the packaging, in the water, in, whatever else. There's like xenoestrogens leaching in from the plastic to the animal fats of whatever protein or cheese that you're eating. And then your body is metabolizing that as estrogen. Why is that something that people on the left were afraid to talk about? And then just leave it open to all of these, far-right content creators to just fucking wring that thing out, twist that knife as long as they possibly can, that, the left doesn't care about your reproductive health. If your standards of aesthetics and beauty are you want to have a masculine presentation, then you're doing fascism, or just all of this kind of like deranged stuff. Because we kind of went through these different things like inflation and crime and nuclear power and the Enlightenment and whatever. And like the kind of biggest, most obvious one is that like, here's a chemical material crisis where the left-wing position is basically that corporations should have unfettered license to dump endocrine disrupting chemicals into the public water supply without any regulation from the state. Like that is basically kind of like the boilerplate position on these things. It's either true or they should be able to do it. And, they will even say this. It's like, well, testosterone is responsible for all the wars. So maybe it would be good if we had I've had people from the left say this to me, that like, well, maybe it would be good because there would be less conflict in the world once our kind of aggressive impulses were taken down. It's like, are you fucking out of your, like, okay, in like, so how about World War II, for like, the worst version of this, right? There was like, there was more of an existing social safety net in the post-war boom. And, testosterone levels were measurably higher. Like, these curves are actually moving in different directions, right? Like the immiseration of people, the degree to which we care for the unfortunate in our society, that trend is divergent with the amount of testosterone. So to like blame male aggression for austerity and neoliberalism and whatever else, it's like, it is just kind of like an insane pairing of two things that are totally unconnected. But that's kind of one of my favorite topics to harp on for people, because it's so immediately solvable. Where, if you look at Europe, to their great credit, has really comprehensive legislation around a handful of chemicals that were put particularly into children's plastic toys that were, this is a little upsetting, in some cases sterilizing them inadvertently. Toys that children would chew on, the plastic contained these endocrine disrupting chemicals that would result in extremely low fertility rates later in life. That is now illegal in Europe. You'll actually see the stickers on children's toys. We still have that in the United States. It's like fucking crazy. It's like, how about some sweeping legislation to just take these things out of the production line? That would seem pretty progressive and in the, health interests of most people. But that is not what we seem to be interested to do on the Western left, or from the academy, so to speak. So yeah, one of my favorite topics to harp on.
I'm so glad you brought that up. You know what? Screw central planning. I did not intend on talking about this issue, even though I've been quietly looking at it for quite a while. But it's, like you said, a very difficult issue to broach with people on the left. You're immediately looked at as some sort of crackpot. They think you're like, only RFK or some weird people like Alex Jones look at this issue, when this is like something that's been quietly being studied by the sciences. And there's a lot of discourse in the science community about all this. But it's been, totally, for some reason, not been taken up in politics, unfortunately, only by kind of people on the libertarian, or not even libertarian, just like kind of some people on the right, not even everyone on the right, but some people. On the left, it's weird. Like, the left has become way more pro big pharma, and it's very, very strange. But yeah, no, like, central planning, guys, all you need to know, okay, Jeff Bezos is building socialism. And Lenin would be proud. Lenin would be, I'd be like, Jeff Bezos, this guy is setting the terrain. And read People's Republic of Walmart by Lee Phillips. That's kind of what Josh was referring to when talking about that earlier. And Inventing the Future by Nick Cernick, another good one. But I think, you give a perfect segue there to the back room. I think we'll get straight into the back room, because this is a topic, oh man, I've been wanting to talk about it, but it's a hard one to broach, and it's also not my wheelhouse, but it is. I'm guessing, have you looked into Dr. Shanna Swan?
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Countdown is her book. A lot of the stuff I'm paraphrasing is from that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's where I kind of, was learning a lot about a lot of this from too, and some other sources too. But we'll get into that in the back room. If you're not a member of the One Dime Radio or One Dime Patreon club already, you get exclusive access to the Discord server, and over at this point, I think, almost 50 exclusive episodes. You can join a nice community to discuss these big contradictions. And yeah, it's less than the price of a Starbucks latte. So instead of buying one of those Starbucks lattes, you can, just do $5 a month. Very easy peasy.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens, and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.